Hello, welcome. This is Think for Yourself, an introduction to critical thinking. In this course, we're exploring some of the basic rules for good thinking and rules for evaluating arguments. If you'd like to follow along, this is the textbook we're taking a look at, A Workbook for Arguments by David Morrow and Anthony Weston. So welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to be looking at Rule 6. The idea that we need to use consistent terms when we make arguments, and that when we evaluate arguments, we need to look for the consistency of the terms that people use. This is really very, very important because ultimately, if people change the nature of how they're using their terminology or their concepts, it becomes very, very difficult for a reader to understand. It also becomes difficult for the author to understand what they're actually arguing. So being consistent and ultimately being concise is really, really quite important. Whoa, there we go. Let's take a look here. So just put it this way, when terms are introduced throughout an argument, they have to be used consistently. Well, why? Two reasons. The first and the most important reason is because we have to avoid contradiction. Remember, contradiction means a contradiction occurs when someone posits that something both is and is not at the same time, in the same way, and in the same respect, right? It's basically when someone says something is both the case and not the case simultaneously. So, for instance, and this is usually referred to by philosophers as the law of non-contradiction. But for instance, when you say, imagine if I said, you're watching this video lecture right now, but you're not watching this video lecture right now at this exact same moment, right? That wouldn't make sense. Or imagine if your professor said, you go to your professor and you ask, what's my grade in the course? And their response is, you have an A and you have an F. And you asked, for the entire course? And they said, yes, you have both an F and you have an A, right? You would be completely confounded, right? Because that doesn't make any sense. A contradiction is so critical to all of human reasoning that whenever it's violated, it ultimately destroys our ability just to make sense of something. So you have to avoid contradiction. Now, what can happen here is that when you don't use your terms consistently, and this typically occurs in like a longer essay format or in a long discussion or something, if you start changing the way in which you use your terms, right, and here think about the difference between the connotation and the denotation of terms, but when you start to change what your terms are referring to, then what that means is that you're actually you actually have multiple terms that all look the same. This is the fallacy of equivocation. And the fallacy is when you start treating different terms equally. And this frequently happens because a lot of times our words actually have two or more meanings, right? So for instance, if someone says all men are mortal, right? That statement doesn't mean that only men are mortal and women are immortal, right? Men there refers to humankind. So you can see here, so if I thought that you meant that all men, only the gender of males are mortal by saying all men are mortal, then you can see that's an equivocation of the way our terms are being used. I'm using them one way, you're using them a different way. So you have to avoid that because then you can start to contradict yourself without realizing it. Now, the second more obvious reason and more general reason is you want to use these consistent terms in order to avoid confusion. Because remember that you're making the argument and you're tracing through the argument a series of terms and ideas, right? When you make a thesis, for instance, if you're writing a paper, right, you use the term once and you're tracing that idea up through your conclusion, right? Or if you're reading a great literature, the ideas presented in the introduction should somehow resurface throughout and by the end. So that way you've gone somewhere with your argument. You've learned something. But when you're not sure how the terms are getting used, confusion sets in, and that means that your argument decays, as it will, because it's no longer can make as much sense. And also, usually what happens is people start using lots of different terms, and then they themselves become confused about what they're writing about or thinking about. A lot of times my students do this. They'll change their terms because they'll just look up a synonym in the thesaurus. I think there's a bug there. They'll look up a synonym in a thesaurus and then just use these new terms, but that changes all of the connotations and the denotations, and then I lose track of what they're actually arguing, and I'll find that the student themselves, by the end, becomes confused about what the thesis is. So you need to be clear about these terms. Now, there's a thing we call couching an idea, right? You have to learn to couch the idea in order to thread it through the argument. And that's how I sort of think of this idea of couching an idea. You have to make an argument, you have to thread an idea through a series of statements. This also applies conversely when we're evaluating arguments. One of the ways in which we can track an author's ideas is to look at how they're using their terms and whether or not these terms are consistent. When they're not consistent, that gives us grounds to criticize the argument. And so this refers to the consistency. So one of the things to do is to mark each new step of an argument or statement of an argument with the same terms that were previously used together. Now this really applies more to short arguments rather than long arguments. Because if you're reading a long argument, and I mean like a 200-page argument or something, right? You don't want to keep using the same terms over and over and over again because people will just lose the ability to understand what you're talking about for different reasons. But when you're making a short argument, as most of my students are doing in their papers, then what you want to do is you want to make sure to use those same terms. So have that consistent usage. For instance, was there something else here? Yeah, okay, that's right. By the way, so for instance, compare these two arguments. So and both of these come from the textbook. When you learn about, this thing does not, okay, sorry about that. When you learn about other cultures, you start to realize the variety of human customs. This new understanding of diversity of social practices may give you a new appreciation of other ways of life. Therefore, studying anthropology tends to make you more tolerant. There's a little misspelling there. Tends to make you more tolerant. Now notice here that the first statement's talking about cultures, the second one's talking about social practices, and the third is talking about anthropology. Now it's clear that when you're talking about cultures, you can also talk about social practices of those cultures. And when you're talking about anthropology, you can also be talking about culture, but remember that anthropology, not all discussions of culture are anthropological. And so you can see here is that because there's three different terms being used, what we really have are three different statements that don't quite connect together. They're really referring to three different things, and they don't quite line up. There is an association between the terms, and that's something to keep in mind here. What can occur is what we might call a fallacy of association, where you associate one idea with another idea, but implicitly your argument needs to follow through on the first idea, not the ideas that are associated, maybe for explanatory purposes. Now, by contrast, compare this argument. When you learn about other cultures, you start to realize the variety of human customs. When you start to realize the variety of human customs, you tend to become more tolerant. Therefore, when you learn about other cultures, you tend to become more tolerant. Now, there's a couple of reasons here. Notice, and I've highlighted in red, in blue, how the terms are being used again and again in connection with each other. So you see cultures in the beginning, you see it at the end, you also see human customs. So it says when you learn about cultures, you start to realize the variety of human customs. And then they're saying when you learn the variety of human customs, then you become tolerant. Therefore, when you learn about cultures, you become more tolerant. This is actually a particular type of form of argument we call the hypothetical syllogism, where you're saying, if you learn this, then you learn this. Since you learn this, you'll therefore get this, right? We have cultures, customs, tolerance, right? It traces it through. So this is a much, much stronger argument. It's also clear what they're talking about. They're talking about cultures, they're talking about customs, and now I actually have a sense of what tolerance means here. When before, notice, I don't really quite know what that means. It says, when you learn about other cultures, you start to realize the variety of human customs. Okay, you realize it, and then this realization gives you appreciation. But how does appreciation give you tolerance? Right, so you can see here that the language is presuming something there, and so it's not as clear. So this is a good example of how we should use concise terminology in order to thread those arguments through. Now, finally here we'll conclude by saying a tight argument outweighs a stylish argument. When you're evaluating whether or not something is rational and you're trying to critically analyze something or make a critical argument yourself, a good argument should be tight. That is, it should be as short as possible, really, and it should be as clear as possible, and where everything matches up. And ultimately, it's clear what the premises are, and it's clear how the premises are being related to each other and how the inference is structured. So you want to make an argument that's tight. Stylish arguments, people often use like flowery language, for instance, right? Style is, you can appreciate it as a reader, but style there can get in the way. And I think that when style gets in the way of the argument because it's no longer clear what the argument is, because the style is outweighing the actual content of the argument, when that occurs, then I think that you really need to pull back on the style, because the goal of communicating ideas and of making ideas is to actually make ideas connect together and to communicate those ideas. And if your style is so emotionally laden that you lose track of the terminology of how it's used, then a problem's arisen. So it's a tight argument, a well-structured argument outweighs a stylish and a quote-unquote well-written argument, right? So what are some ideas here? One would be avoid using a thesaurus to replace repetitive language. If you're writing an essay or you're writing an email, right? Don't email, probably not, but if you're writing a paper, don't. I used to do this when I was in high school. I used to just go through the paper and use this thesaurus. It's how I could make it a more colorful argument, and oftentimes it sounded better, but it was less clear what I was actually arguing. So use a thesaurus. You can always use a thesaurus, but you shouldn't rely upon it as a thesaurus for style, right? Because otherwise you'll conceptually destabilize the argument, right? And I think you should always use the same terms for consistency and clarity. But one of the things you can do, and the textbook doesn't talk about this, but I think you can alternate the syntax and the rhythm of your argument for readability. So instead of being worried about writing a stylish argument, if you're going to write an argument, instead use the same terms consistently, but rotate the syntax, the way in which you order your sentences, in order to create a rhythm for the reader to follow along with, using the syllables. I think that the goal shouldn't be style, it should be readability, right? And that's, if you will, going back to our previous video on the spectrum of rhetoric, right? The psychology of rhetoric versus the reasonableness of rhetoric. I think you want to lean towards the reasonability there, and that means that it needs to be a readable or a well understood argument. So if you're making an argument in public or with a colleague or a family member, right? What you need to learn to do is to use consistent terms, but to alternate the flow of the presentation so that way it continues to capture the intention of the audience, as well as to be interesting. And I love well written arguments, but ultimately it's the tight arguments that matter most. So anyway, that is rule 6. Sorry, I'm going through this. That is rule 6 there, using consistent terms. Thank you very much for watching Think for Yourself. We'll see you guys online next time.